Hey, I'm trying to make sure I'm not muted. This is late in the evening. So, welcome, um, Leslie Dawn Callahan, the Reverend Dr. Leslie Dawn Callahan, to this conversation where we honor our patron saint, as we call Jarena Lee, by having a conversation of what it means to be be a woman pressing through tradition and all of that. And we're going to talk about Jarena Lee, but I'm also going to ask you to talk about your own journey. We both have stories we can tell. So welcome. And I think if you will type in the comments, if you're on the StreamYard, we'll be able to see them. And then if you're on the uh, Facebook page, I'm hoping our admin will help us moderate if there are questions or comments we need to attend to. So, uh, Pastor Callahan,
Good
welcome to
evening.
the conversation. And February 11th was Jarena Lee's birthday, the day she entered Earth. You have stood in the pulpit where she overtook in Mother Bethel in 1817 when the Spirit moved on her and she preached her first sermon. You stood in that pulpit where she was. I think it may not it may not be in the same place it was, but symbolically it's the same, certainly the same church. What was that like for you?
So, I, I never stood in the pulpit at Mother Bethel to preach, but I have had occasion to be in worship in Mother Bethel, and I have been in the pulpit at Mother Bethel to do other things, and I guess in some ways, um, uh, Jarena Lee, uh, I guess when she entered the room, she didn't know she was going to preach. I mean, Mother Bethel is an extraordinarily important place um, in the city of Philadelphia, in the United States, in Black church life, in the church, in church life in general. I actually had occasion to talk about the importance of Mother Bethel um, just yesterday as a part of a Black History Month conversation, and um, the work of Richard Allen and the AME Church and independent Black institutions and Black Christianity. All of those elements are really important. Um, and of course, to me, Jarena Lee is especially important. Her life, her ministry are especially important because of the way that she remains a reminder of um, God's call, of um, God's amazing grace, and of God's capacity to decide whom God is going to work with and how. Um, so um, I think about her work a lot. I think about what it means that she told her story, that she wrote her story, not only to testify about what God had done for her, but also um, to make the case for not limiting God's work in others.
I was trying to think of that quote. When she is kind of repelling this notion that God wouldn't call the woman would call a man but not a woman, and does that mean that God is half
Hmm.
God? Eh, wouldn't God,
Partial finger, yes, yeah.
you know, um, speak through everyone? I mean, are you saying God can't do that? I mean, her apologist for it, um, I mean, probably gives all of us something to think about. I find it odd that it's 2023 and this is still in my mind a relevant conversation,
Sure.
that there are still too many evidence to the contrary people who don't believe God call women to preach.
Yeah.
And I don't know what to make of how much evidence do you need?
Uh, yeah. I think all of us have to decide how. I guess I'm approaching it from the position of a person as a woman who preaches and pastors. That I think in every generation and in every individual, we have to decide how much time or energy we're going to spend making the case for our call. Um, and if we're going to make any kind of case for it, what sort of case are we going to make? I mean, I think Jarena Lee is instructive. She makes every sort of case. She tells her own testimony. She does her own exegetical work, and her apologetics. And then, but mostly what she does is um, to offer a demonstration of the fruit of her labor.
Right. 2,000 miles of travel.
And the and it it kind of ends up in her narrative being God convinced me, God convinced Richard Allen, and then God convinced a whole lot of other people over the course of her ministering life and in her journeys. But I guess again, I think we all have to figure out how much time we want to spend or we're going to spend making a case, and then what sort of case. What I appreciate about Jarena Lee is that I I don't know a more artful way to say it, is that she doesn't make a whiny case for
Right.
her ministry and for her ministering. Um, Once she is persuaded that it is God who is calling her and that she can't really get away from the God part of the call, she she doesn't whine about it. She just um, she demonstrates it. She asserts that she lives in and into the ministry, um, the particularly the evangelistic ministry that God has given her. And so I think that even if we feel compelled on some occasions to say, here's why I think God does work with me in these ways, even if we feel like we're going to make that case, um, I think she's a good reminder that we shouldn't be.
Energy.
It's a hard case to make if you don't really act like you're persuaded of it.
Right. If you feel like you can't operate into the call that God has to you until you get approval, what you're suggesting and what I'm agreeing to is do it the Jarena Lee way, which is press into what God is calling you to do, approval or not. And, Jarena Lee is posthumously ordained by the church that accepted her gifts but didn't ordain her while she was living. Otherwise, she couldn't have had all of these visitations. And even the people who didn't ordain her said she was ordained of God. I mean, they acknowledge that. So when you say how much energy do you want to put into that, I think there's some self-respect, some self-reflection about how needy we are for approval before we do what God has called us to do. Because you're saying
I think I think sometimes again, I'm thinking about Jarena Lee here too. I mean, sometimes we take other people's disapproval as a way out, as an exit that we're sort of looking for anyway. And
yeah,
she starts there. And when she initially expresses her call and she hears that the discipline doesn't make room for it, she says, "Great." And takes it as an opportunity to go on back to whatever it was the other thing she's planning to do. Um, I mean, I think I'm old school enough to you know, I'm old school enough to have grown up hearing, if you cannot do it, then don't. Um, and I guess that's part of it. Like if you can find a way out of following or being responsible to or yoked into this call, find a way out. Um, only do it insofar as you feel compelled. Um, by the call itself and by a sense of restlessness outside of it. Um, so I mean, maybe that's the suspicion too. Maybe people are looking for an out in other people by means of other people's disapproval. I would have done it if people had been more accepting, or if I had gotten the yes from the people whose opinion mattered to me, or uh, uh, whose approval I sought. Um,
And not all of that consciously, right, are people thinking.
yeah, no, not all of it. And and the unconsciousness goes on every side. I think in our times, maybe more troubling to me than the people who are in the category of believing that God simply does not call women to do certain things. More troubling are the people who are really unconsciously opponents of women's calls, but who don't even know that they're on the opposition side, who think of themselves as generally supportive, who think of themselves as generally an ally, or whatever the language is that they want to use. I mean, the people who do far more damage are the people who don't know that they oppose women's calls, or that they oppose the working of God outside of whatever um, strictures they've imagined for God.
Right.
That those are the people who do harm, who do more harm, um, because those are the people who make the people who are called feel like it's not that I'm against women, I'm just against you.
Oh, yeah.
It's not that there's something wrong with the general category of women. It's just you who aren't called. It's not women at
Right.
large who aren't called. And so they're kind of looking for there is some woman somewhere who would be appropriate, but just not you. And no, well, not her either. And well, no, not her either. Those folks are the ones who are the most dangerous. And because the people who just oppose your call, you can work your way around them. But the folks who feed the sense of personal insecurity, and I'm not good enough, or if I were just more of this or that thing, those
So
folks are really dangerous, because those people are the ones who can actually um, discourage us.
I would say that the socialization is actually on both sides as well. So women in general in our culture, and by our right now, I mean the USA, but I don't doubt this that it's true in other places, that women are socialized to attend to what other people think, feel, and need. And so that notion of, well, maybe there is a woman, but not me,
Mhm.
is even in the socialization of that, if that makes sense. On both sides, I think.
It is, yeah. I mean, I think, y you know, um, uh, I often think, and maybe have probably have even said in conversation with you before, Dr. Bridgman, that, I mean, I think we still live with the reality that if you say the word preacher or pastor and somebody conjures an image in their head, most of the time the image they conjure isn't it isn't me or you, or and that can be true even when you're their preacher, their pastor. I know I've told this story before about the time we were singing. Somebody prayed for me at the St. Paul's Baptist Church, and we got to the pastor prayed for me, and the people sang had me on his mind. I thought,
You're like,
you're okay, but they weren't thinking. Like they just sang, you know.
I,
uh,
yeah, I was going to say, I don't know what kinds of disruptive teaching, training, praying we got to do to pierce through these visual things people have in their mind. I mean, if you say doctor, people's default
mhm.
is often he, even though they know they might even have women doctors in their family, and still, again, I'm talking about the piercing of the midst of patriarchy that I think Jarena Lee did, right? You know, just kind of in her day and in her way went like this through it. But there are multitudes of us now ordained in places that, you know, just 50 years ago, 60 years ago, they weren't thinking about ordaining us. Oh, you know, different people. That wasn't true in the tradition I ended up being ordained in, the Church of God Anderson, because they were ordaining women and there were women pastors, but all around us, that wasn't true of other kinds of denominations. I, I'm back to socialization, I know, and wondering how do we live and preach a gospel as as progeny of Jarena Lee, offspring of Jarena Lee in the spirit, that makes room for these multitudes of congregations. Great is the company of she
Right,
who preaches it, right?
right.
I, I don't know what I'm actually asking you, except for it feels like something is there that still needs to be nourished or nursed, or maybe that's not even the right word.
I mean, I think, yes. I mean, yeah, for sure that there's some need. There's some there is some need to get at that. But I guess I'm feeling some tension in two places. One is the degree to which people are really resistant to being made conscious of things that they don't want to be conscious of. And so
And that's a whole truth.
um that, you know, and I know we sort of like to fancy ourselves to be different from um, you know, our opponents in the Christian nationalist world, or the our opponents in the political world who are using the teaching of history as a weapon against the telling of truth. Um, but the basic human part of this is super similar, right? That um, they're not they're not we all have the capacity to lie to ourselves, and tendency, and becoming conscious of the ways that we're lying to ourselves is difficult for most of us. And if people have the power to resist what's difficult, they will. And so there are ways that coming to terms with patriarchy is painful and difficult for people of all sorts and genders. And so I think one has to expect a fair amount of pushback That's one part. The other part is, you know, it's like it's not clear to me what we get out of this, given, and I don't know really how to say this other than just to say it, given the declining significance of the church across the board. Like, what is it that, I don't mean to say this, but I will, a sort of aside from room to do whatever it is we feel God is calling us to do, which we always have to figure out. But what is it that we're exactly fighting to be a part of, or struggling to um, be recognized by? We're struggling to be recognized by something that no longer matters, or that matters
You
a great deal less than we might want it to. So, um, this puts me in mind, and I don't remember the exact article, but you'll know what I'm talking about. Renita Williams wrote about this a decade ago or longer,
right.
about,
What will it mean?
and it's worse now. And what will it mean? She asked then, and I guess I'm sort of positing and does it really matter? Does anybody care about who leads institutions that they don't care about?
Wow.
Um, so there's a way in which I see lots of what looks like progress in the area of the embrace of women and the leadership of women in churches. Women are getting called more to in the search call process than than I think ever before. I see more Baptist women who are pastoring churches that are established that they didn't found. I see there are more opportunities across the board at the moment when,
The
and we
church is
see
on
this like
fire.
in the moment where the significance of the church in the community is less than it has ever been,
Right.
where the resources of the church to do ministry, whatever, in broad terms, when those resources are shrinking, when the so what does it mean on the one hand? What and does it and what will it matter? Um, all the more reason to go back to the thing I said earlier about that old school, if you cannot do it, don't. Um, this is I have a friend who describes the call to ministry as a call to downward mobility. Uh,
Correct.
so, I mean, I think you do it for something. You do. I mean, I'm still here, but I'm still here. But I'm not. I don't think I don't have illusions about what it means at this point to be here. Um, and I have some real questions about how helpful we actually are, um, and what difference this makes.
Right.
Um, so
Um,
not to be a downer.
oh no, but I mean, I think it's a fair thing to be talking about when we're talking about the inspiration and the challenge. We're and the challenge of distance between us and Jarena Lee, thinking about what is it that we're trying to hold on to? What is it that spirit may be saying, let die so, resurrection can happen in another form, different body? I'm at the text for this or during this week, but I, I don't know that it's a downer to say, and yes, what is it that people are handing over? Because um, women, this happened in nursing, as you know,
Hmm.
I understand that it's happening now actually in specialization in doctors because of the feminization of the field, on and on and on. And you can see the salaries
Mhm.
going down. It's happening in a higher education. So
Mhm.
when I guess what I'm saying is, I think there are two things, that compelling urge of God to do it, and that ego driven, oh my God, I want to do this thing. Those are two separate things. And I don't know what kind of discernment you need to have to know which is which. You know what I mean? It-
Yeah, and yeah, um, again, not to, I mean, not to be a downer, and what's not clear to me is whether, so okay, I'll allow as how in the eternal realm it matters. I'll allow that. But I'm not sure that in the in the here and now, it's not clear to me that the people who are, this is going to sound terrible, but it's not clear to me that people who are like deeply called and God driven are doing better. A- and I mean even at the level of impact, effectiveness.
Well,
eh,
I don't think for me, let me be clear about why I said that. I don't think it's about whether they personally are doing better. It's about, this is all I can do right now. So, like that feeling tethered to, compelled by the call. This is literally, this is all I can do right now. And so you've done the running until you can't run no more,
Sure.
and now it's like, to quote Paul, woe be unto me
If I choose not. Yeah.
if I don't do this, right? For Paul, who's preaching in missionary building churches from place to place. For us, it may be just that, whatever, however the form is that God is calling us. Again, I'm like, we Jarena Lee by no means is the only person that embodied this in her time and coming up. She actually had some contemporaries. And I think now what that says to me is, I think that sometimes we can feel isolated and alone in having made that choice and not paying attention to all of the resources in persons. I mean, in looking around and seeing, oh, there is another woman, there's another woman, there's another woman. And I don't mean by that going to conferences, though there's nothing wrong with going to conferences, but in almost every place, there are other women in leadership and ministry around that we could tap into if we would be willing to be that kind of communal around the call. Somebody took care of Jarena Lee's kids.
Yes, 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 yes. And well, and so I think I don't know that this is where you're going, but I do think that the issue of the network of people we need to live out whatever our call is.
Right. That
Um,
is what I mean.
um, whatever our part is in this in the in the in the doing of life and the doing of ministry. I think that's really important. I think real relationship and friendship and allyship and camaraderie and all of that are really important. Um, I mean, I would not be able to do what I do were it not for a lot of folks But the other side of that is um, it also takes away any illusion that the grass is greener somewhere else. So if we just talk about the work of preaching and pastoring, I have a number of colleagues and dear friends who do this work, and we do it in all kinds of different contexts, and we all have different issues and the same issues at the same time. And I think what we will all testify to is that this is really hard work.
Yes.
It is like on any given day, if I check in, I have a couple of different groups of friends. And on any given day, the only question is whether the question is not whether any of whether there's this is a none of us I can't we never have easy days. Like some days we feel like we have the resources to attend to the myriad critical matters that we have to attend to. Some days we feel like we've got the resources. Some days we feel like we don't have the resources. Some days we are, we're in the positive part of the cycle and the back and forth. But some days it's like, I don't know how I can do this another day. And all of us, different contexts. Some people have big churches, some people have little churches, some people have churches they founded, some people have churches that they were called to or elected to or appointed to. Like it runs the gamut. It's hard for us all. It's really our life circumstances are different. Our family circumstances are different. Our ages are different. It's hard. This is hard work. I hear someone posting about the joy that's present in it, and there is joy in it.
And it's hard work.
And sometimes you just decide to call it joy, right? Like it doesn't feel joyful. You just decide to count it all joy, right? Because that's part of it too. Like sometimes it's not joyous. Sometimes it's just meaningful. Sometimes it's neither joyous and nor are you really sure it's meaningful. Sometimes, but what it always is hard. And I don't mean always burdensome or always oppressive. That's not it's not always that kind of hard. But it's sometimes that kind of hard. Sometimes it's oppressively hard. And I say this as somebody, and I guess here I'm thinking of pastoral ministry and preaching every Sunday or thereabouts. I say that as a person who still feels deeply called to this and who I actually like it but that doesn't keep me from being really aware of how hard it is.
Right.
And I think if you asked me, I would have to say, I think that right now it's especially hard. For the reasons I talked about earlier, that we are exercising in authority in institutions that have declining authority in our society.
Yeah.
We're more and more in the who has believed our report category.
Right. We certainly are post-Constantinian Christianity, where despite all the kicking and screaming about we need a state religion, that's how you know it's even more declining, because you got kicking and screaming we need a state religion to try to hold these spaces. But yes, to what you're saying.
And we've been on the underside of empire. And so most of us, if you'd asked us 20 years ago, how would we greet the decline or the demise of Constantinian Christianity? We would have said, let it go. I certainly 20 years ago, 25 years ago would have said that's good news. And it may yet be. It probably is. It's probably good news. But insofar as it, I mean, I do think that the decline of Christianity as the state religion in the United States is good news for Christianity, for the faith. But it really does mean reinventing or returning or something.
You're back at Mars Hill, where you have to compete for ideas and space,
And part of what I'm thinking about is that it feels to me that the spiritual resources with which to do that are harder to get at. And maybe it's because we're in a kind of, I'll speak for me. Maybe it's because I found myself in a kind of liminal space with some of the institutions still present, with some of the authority of the institution still present. You're sort of kind of betwixt and between. Or maybe Mars Hill's a really great example because Paul at Mars Hill is trying to find
an entree.
Yeah, trying to find how do I talk about this thing that's driving me that the people I'm talking to don't even necessarily believe exists.
Right.
It's one thing for us to argue among ourselves about the meaning of the thing if we all agree it exists. It's one thing to argue scripture with people who all say, okay, these are the authoritative texts that we claim and that we are accountable to. That's one kind of argument. And by the way, I'll say for myself, that's the kind of argument that I'm not interested in at all.
Right.
I've started there, right? I'm not interested in arguing with you about whether you think Paul meant that I wasn't supposed to say something in church. I have no interest whatsoever in that. I actually have a lot of interest in what it means to bear witness to the gospel in a place where people aren't necessarily looking for it.
I have
a lot of interest in that. I guess I like lost causes.
I have an example that will tickle you, I think. Performing in a jazz club where they're serving snacks and drinks, the clinking of, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything in what you're doing on stage will get most of the people's attention long enough for them to hear you? Mm-hmm. Having been in a jazz club and seeing that moment when a really good somebody get to everybody's attention, performing right at the same time, that's what Mars Hill reminds me of, these competing, not even they are ideas, but voices rising. And how do you, I know somebody was scribing for him, but how do you get the attention of the community long enough to make the case? Have you watched any of those Jesus Gets Us?
I have. You couldn't avoid them if you were watching broadcast TV over the last couple of months. You couldn't avoid them entirely. Right. And pretty much the only thing I watch on broadcast TV is sports. And that's kind of where they were showing up. So yeah, I did see them. That's a really good example, because the other problem that we have is that as we start to within this tradition, within the Christian tradition, as we start to try to make a case for what we understand the gospel to be, not only do we have to try to get a hearing, but we also have to distinguish ourselves from people who are using the same language but not meaning the same thing. So
Yeah.
I could easily say that Jesus gets us, but I don't mean by us what they mean by us. And I don't mean by Jesus what they mean by Jesus. And I don't mean by gets what they mean by gets. And so the other challenge that I think those of us, and this is true, this goes back to the coming to terms with the things that you don't want to actually address or acknowledge, that you don't want to address or acknowledge. Coming to terms with the ways that for some people, reasonably, the church represents harm and is a period at the end of that sentence because of the harm that they have experienced and have witnessed. The church and the message represents harm.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have anything really to add to that.
And
Yes.
we can't be, one, we shouldn't be dishonest about that.
Right.
And
I
we
certainly
have to
hear
find a
you.
way not to be defensive about it.
Right. Right.
So I don't know. Part of what's hard, I mean, that's hard. Like that's all, excuse me. These are all of the pieces of the declining significance. Um, and the question about whether there's a way, um, and so I will say for me, like I believe I believe I still am compelled by the life and the ministry and the story and the dying and the rising of Jesus. That's still the story that turns my gears. That's still how I understand reality. And I still believe that and simultaneously I still believe that if we're going to engage in if we're going to be all right in the here or the hereafter, that we've got to find some people to do life with on behalf of something greater than ourselves. So I still believe in the church. That's how I understand the church, right?
Right.
That I still believe that. I'm still persuaded of that. But it does kind of feel like I wonder whether you can I'm still persuaded of that. But it does sort of feel like I'm not sure I got enough time to see the emergence or of whatever that's going to look like, whatever new thing that's going to look like for that the new and living thing that's going to look like in this context, because I'm pretty clear that what we have collectively made of Christianity in the United States, I've been saying this like pretty explicitly, that American Christianity is it's a bankrupt project. And if I'm saying that as somebody who still deeply believes in Jesus and still deeply believes in Christian community in the church, if I'm saying this thing is a bankrupt project, what are other people who have not spent their life being persuaded? I, I,
I mean, it's a fair question. I'm trying to watch the chat, and I'm wondering if there are any questions about anything you and I have been talking about, or even any insight anybody wants to um, to add. I did see somebody say, "But we can't give up," and I was thinking, um, you said this, but I'm gonna say it again. It's hard work, and I think what makes it possible to do the work to the end is to not pretend like it's not hard work.
yeah,
That you just learn how to take breaths, pray as you breathe, and all the kinds of things it means to keep going. And yeah, sometimes sit down and sit in the corner, and as one of our elder sisters would say, suck your thumb and wait on God, you know, because sometimes that's the thing. Um,
yeah. I mean, I let's go back to Jarena Lee. Um, and this goes back to the spiritual resources part. Jarena Lee did her work in this tension between the work she could do, which is get on the horse and show up to places, right? That's the part she has to do. And then the part that she absolutely trusted God for, which was the conviction of the spirit part.
correct.
And I think, I mean, as I speak to this myself, I think that part is the part that maybe I need to have more confidence in. That the that somehow God, in the midst of this, that we show up to this work, this hard work that's ours, and that God, in the midst of it, makes something of it for some people along the way. But now, and I say, because this is the way I think about it, right? I argue with my own self, and then I argue with my own self, and I'm like, yeah, but she did all of that, all them thousands of miles, and her own people wouldn't even ordain her. So it's not like, I mean, she was good and dead, like 150 years dead, before her. I don't know. I mean, that's hard, right? Like, so on the one hand, her labor was absolutely not in vain. We're talking about her. On the other hand, I, I, that's kind of how I feel about it. I feel like I'm like, okay, and some mornings I get up and I have this like back and forth tussle in my own heart and mind. And I'm like, okay, God, are you going to do something with this labor? Are you doing something with this labor that I don't know about?
Right, right.
Um, are you, and the answer to that is always yes.
But,
And
but you want to say, speak English, God, use your words.
yes, yes, yeah. And sometimes give me a little something
Right.
that helps me not to feel like I'm wasting my life. I mean, some sign that something, like, I get you never know all of the significance of your life. You don't. But give me is there a, Easter egg or something along the way, just some indication that I'll give you, for instance, you know, we we watch. over the last decade or so, we have watched the rinse and repeat of generally young Black people dying, sometimes on film. And every time one of them dies, there's a funeral, there's a public funeral, the big one, right? Or in the case of George Floyd, 5 of them, where somebody in the name of the Lord takes a text and says, this is the one that's going to change everything. And I've come to the point where I'm like, we should stop telling people that lie. That's a lie. At this point, we should stop. We should stop telling that. I mean, there may be one someday that's really the end of this, but it hasn't happened yet. And it ain't right. It's not right to continue to pretend like the meaning of this, that's not what redemption looks like for these scenes. And what I want for myself as a preacher in a much smaller, not with 100,000 people listening to me, but with a couple dozen, I want not to be lying. Yes, Talani, we should stop looking for that one thing that changes everything. I want us to stop lying. And maybe I hear Pastor Casey talking about the beloved community. Maybe the ways that we and I guess this is what I think. Maybe the ways that we give ourselves for a lifetime, but every day, to the work of being the people of God is all we get. Maybe that's all we get is the excruciating delight of giving ourselves day to day for a lifetime to this possibility.
Knowing that we may not, quote, receive the promise on this side.
Knowing and knowing that's right. And stop making other promises. Like, what if the thing that we offer, what if the thing that God is offering us and the thing that we're offering in our preaching is just that, the opportunity to give ourselves day to day to this hope. I guess is the word is hope. We give ourselves to this hope. We live in hope. Even Paul got that, right? Like Paul is like, clearly, hope that's seen is
not hope. Yeah.
So whatever's happened 2,000 years ago with Paul, he was like, I'm not seeing it either. I'm giving my life to this. And maybe in that process, we get insights and we discover that the creation is groaning for, awaiting for this hope. And we help to plant seeds of hope in community. And we so I mean, but I want to deal with, I do want to deal with what's real here. Like, I want us to stop lying. I don't want to leave that. I mean, I felt I felt the hopeful preaching come up,
I,
kind of
I,
rise up.
I actually saw it overtake
Yeah.
you there. But
Um, so
but when
so
you say that,
I don't want
let,
to,
let
but
me
I
say
don't want to be
this.
lying, right? I don't want us to leave. I think
Let me
for
say this about that. I
yeah,
I wonder if this is not an excuse. This is a question for explanation. I wonder if people are lying or self-deceptive. So if you're self-deceiving, it is a lie, but not to you
you're right.
because of the story you've told yourself for whatever it is that you are admitting or even committing to keep that lie going. And by lie, this could be
Yeah,
things like it's not hard, glory to God,
yeah.
Jesus, all the kinds of
I
things we do to numb what this
yeah.
is hard means.
There are a lot of things going through my mind. I'm also looking at the chat, and I think there's a very interesting kind of conversation that's happening in the chat that I'm resonating a lot with all of the pieces. Um, um, there is there is extraordinary joy. Um, there's extraordinary joy in response, Pastor Casey, to finally being able to do what God called you to do. However you're getting to do it, you're like, because there is a way that when you wait such a long time, you think I'm never going to actually get to do the thing that God has called me to do. And it's euphoric. I have been there. And I return to it. Like I'm 14 years in at St. Paul's in May, and I still have moments of just extraordinary gratitude that I get to do this, and that I still get to do this, and that we still want to be in this space together. That's extraordinary, and I count it an enormous grace. I still feel that. And there is Talani magic. Magic's a word I love. That I don't do I've started to just call it magic because that's what it feels. It's it's like magic, like Disney's magic. Like it's all of
Right.
the it's like the heavens open and the stars twinkle, and
Right.
there are moments and sometimes even seasons. There are ways that um so there's that. But then there are also moments of like deep disappointment. Naomi, yes. Uh the God's what is God doing some of the time? You're like, are you, I mean, the the universe and space, you did that a while ago, and that seems to be working out. So what are you do what you do what are you doing? And is there anything that I could do to move this project along a little better?
Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
so I mean, I feel all of that. So I feel all of that. Yeah, Reverend Naomi just said that God is resting on laurels. Um,
woo.
so so and what I'm appreciating about this conversation, and part of the reason why I'm like going all the way here, is that I think whatever it is we're going to do that is going to be meaningful for a generation of people who are not as gullible as some of us were, whatever it is that we are going to do that is going to be meaningful in this generation is going to have to be brutally honest. I think, and this is true, I am Gen X. I am a middle-aged Black woman, but even I've already told you, stop telling me that this is the one that's going to change it all. I don't want to hear it. I get that far and then I turn it off. I'm like, I'm not interested in that. That's obviously a lie. So if I don't want to hear it, and I have given my life, I am giving my life day by day to this project. I'm all in. If I don't want to hear it, then I'm pretty sure the people I want to talk to don't want to hear it either. Maybe that's it. Maybe I just want to talk to maybe and maybe that's it. Maybe like there's a little group of folks who want to have this hard conversation and who want to do it in such a way that is open to the possibility that God might show us something, that God might show up in us and in the midst of us in some way that makes some of this make sense.
You're calling for a kind of communal discipleship. I, I'm going to say among preachers because, this whole thing of, yo, God, if I'm saying 2 or 3, 11 or 12 are in that space, yeah, show up. How God shows up sometimes, I think, is the thing that we struggle most with. Because I think the mystery is that we don't know and can't seem to know. People have been asking that question for
Yes.
millennia.
Yes.
You can see it in the scripture, but you can also see it in Christian history.
Yes, you can.
Yo, God, what is you up to? When Phyllis Tickle wrote her book, I forget the actual title, but the one that talks about the church does a major transformation every 500 years,
Mm-hmm.
20,000, the 2K, that's the next 500. We're in that
Where
great
they
turmoil that you're kind of describing. And yet hundreds of us are still feeling this call.
Yes.
In the midst of this great turmoil, we don't know what this is going to be. I actually said something that you will find probably surprised that I said, because I am usually not the hopeful one in the conversation. I'm usually the Eeyore in the conversation. Eeyore. But someone asked me, about this decline in church, and I said to him, I'm not worried about the church dying. The church is gonna be 2 or 3 gathered, and they're going to be gathered in different places, and the church is going to be, I kind of start going through this. It's like this, I think it's the how we navigate that change and our fear of change that's going to help us through this portal of change. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I think, and how we, yes, and I will say, and how we stop looking over the fence at people who seem to be doing better. Particularly people who we don't want to be like anyway. Like, it's like, okay, so maybe you could do better if you did it that way, but can you really do it that way? It's like, is that you? Like, can you do that? And if you can, go ahead and try. But if you can't, stop looking over the fence. Because if you can't do it, you might as well just skip it. Don't. I mean, I think that's the hard part too. I think I'll say that's a challenge. I sometimes I encounter it more when I can't figure out what I think God is doing with me. When I feel like I know what God is doing with me, I'm not that worried about what God is doing or what's happening across the fence. But when I can't figure out what God is doing with me and I don't have a sense of clear direction for me, and I feel like I'm out here in a space where God and some people have entrusted me with leadership and authority. Then I'm looking around like, okay, can this thing I feel like I'm supposed to be doing be done? And what does it look like? And what happens if I'm wrong?
That's what I mean by the fear, because all those questions point to the fear of, and rightfully so, of wanting to get it right,
Right.
you know, because it is your life that's in it. When you say this yes to this call, to this God, to this gospel, you're all in. Well, it's hard to. I know that scripture says, you could turn back from the plow, but the truth be told, any of us been doing this a while know that ain't easy to do.
I mean, but I can't turn back to being 20 years old.
Right.
Like there is a point at which I remember in one of these seasons, I remember hearing the voice of God be like, "You've come too far and not too far and not far enough at the same time. Like you're too far in to quit, but you're not far enough to stop." And that's
Now that's a word.
um, you know, so yeah, you could. I mean, I mean, we have skills, Bridgman. I mean, I think we probably could get a job somewhere, um, and pay the mortgage, um, and reinterpret the entirety of our lives. People do it. Apparently, a lot of people are doing it right in through here. People
Yeah.
are quitting this project left, right, and sideways.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm not in a season particularly where I feel like quitting. Um, I am in a season where I don't feel like doing it dishonestly. I feel like, and I actually think that's the gift. I actually think the gift of the gospel is that we don't have to be dishonest.
Right.
I think that's the gift, that I think looking the brutality of the cross in the face, like for real, is a space to honor that violence and brutality and meanness and real honest to God evil are present, but they're not all that's present.
Right.
So don't
Someone said recently to me that our definition of evil is all and nothing, and that keeps us from dealing with evil.
yes.
We either say it's evil and I'm just not gonna look at that, or we don't know this whether or not it's evil, and
Yeah.
we don't question it. Um, Part of what underneath all of that is the whole sense of discernment.
Mm,
If I go back to Jarena Lee, she had somebody help her take care of her children. She felt compelled to do this, but if you read her autobiography, it seems clear she was discerning when to go where,
mhm.
when to go in this direction and not that direction, because she actually went down into some slave owning states
Yes.
as a free woman. So underneath that, I heard discernment. Did you want to say something about that?
I think the I think this is a place to come back to magic and mystery, and the spiritual resources, um and the risk taking, because you know
Yeah.
the leading is not always like it's one thing to say in hindsight, ah, yes, God led me this way. But often, when at least my experience is that often how I know is a lot less sort of specific and clear than those words. I- Sometimes God's leading is clear. and I'm like, okay, this is what I have to do. Or I can't do other than this.
Right.
Sometimes God's leading is more opaque. And in hindsight, I can see, yeah, I mean, even on those kind of days, I know you have these days, Dr. Valerie, where you end up someplace and you're like, oh, I was supposed to be here. But you usually figure that out after you already got there,
Right.
not necessarily before you go.
Right.
You get there and you're like, ah, this was where I was supposed to be. But
It,
how did you get there? And
right.
that part is not always as clear.
Clear. Yeah.
Um,
It's that
I do
concept
think
of,
here's what I rely on, though, and I'll say this as our hour is drawing nigh. I do rely on that God knows I want to be led.
right. Right.
That God knows, and that God that that the most fundamental thing that I believe about God is that God actually isn't just jerking me around. And that God doesn't have any interest in fooling me, right? So God knows I want to be led, and God knows how to lead. And so that's a place of trust. And then as I feel kind of urged and nudged, more often than I love this image from Prathia Hall. Prathia Hall had this image of God's fist in her back. And sometimes it is God's fist in our back. But it's not always that. And whether it's that or some other or just an inkling, or sometimes it's just what I want. And that whatever it is, that God both knows how to lead and knows that I want to be led, and that I can be a little more trusting. Say this last thing. Uh, you know, I do think that there's a measure of um, investment in getting it right and being right that we have to let go of.
Yes.
One, there's a measure of investment in there only being one right way to do things that
Right.
we have to let go of. But also, like for people who supposedly trust God, we don't have a lot of confidence in the grace of God if we get it wrong.
Right.
It's like we trust the grace of God to make us get it right. As opposed to, I mean, part
Persevere.
of the beauty of God being God is that God's contingency plans are flawless. So that even if I end up in the wrong place, even if I do the wrong thing, even if I make the wrong choice, God has ways
Of working that in for good. Not that that was good, but
It was the wrong thing, but God has a way of weaving it into a thing that's not wrong.
yeah.
And ultimately bringing me to the next space and being like, I wish that at the time I had made a different choice, but I'm glad now for the ways that now that's what redemption actually looks like. That's what redemption is.
Agree.
The way that God moves, even in the mid. So what I want, and this is really what I really want, and I say this particularly to my sisters in ministry. The church tells us, the institution tells us that we have to get everything right to be worthy, and then they treat us like we're not worthy anyway. And what I wish for us is that we'd say to hell with that. And really I wish we would let go of that. I said in a conversation, when Dr. Weems was hosting conversations. Like there are ways that trying to be good and right just inhibits growth
Right. Because
and fun.
you're trying to avoid tension. You're trying to avoid not being uncomfortable, or whatever, I don't know, whatever other words that are in there. But all of that, the tension, all of that is actually a part of the cause, the part of this whole process. I've been doing this a long time. I can't think of a time where there weren't major seasons of struggling and tension and the like, in the call. This June June will be 45 years for me, and I can't I can't imagine. Am I right about the years? But in any event, I can't imagine the not struggling through to it, right? Even if you feel like you're along, I'm gonna go back to what I started off by saying. Part of what you get from reading Jarena Lee's autobiography is she didn't feel alone. This wasn't Sojourner Truth saying none but Jesus is with me. She had networks of people along the way, and she wrote letters back to people, so it's clear she had community, is I guess what I'm trying to say. And so when you part of your question that you started with about, is it worth it? And then what do we do with this grace of God that we actually don't want to embrace? Because some of what we actually do embrace is this very Americanized Calvinism where productivity makes you good,
Mm-hmm.
and if you don't have that, you're not good, right? So the challenge I hear is still community. That's that's kind of a antidote against, or in the midst of the struggle, maybe.
I believe that. Yes, community is really. I mean, I think the gift of community is a part of what is a part of God's intention for us. But I keep pressing. But you got to actually show up as yourself. It, you have to be honest and stop lying. Someone in the chat said authenticity. Like, community can't help you if you won't be honest.
True.
Um, I mean, I wonder whether God can help us if we won't be honest. Um, God be trying to help us be honest, and we just won't. And so, um, and particular, I mean, you're talking about what it means to have networks of folks who help you to do your ministry, and to live, right? Because taking care of your kids is part of your life. It's not just your ministry.
Right.
Um, but you have to be willing to acknowledge that you need that help. You have to be vulnerable, um, in a way, and willing to take the risks, again, of honesty. Like, here's the limit. Here's what I can and cannot do. Um, here's what I won't do. Here's what I don't want to do. And some of the things we don't want to do still need to be done. And who is it to do those things? Um,
I mean, I'm just gonna say yes. We're close to the end of our time. Are there comments, questions, um, acknowledgments around Jarena Lee in the chat, or that anybody want to hop in?
Mm. That's real. Some days our capacity ain't much. That's real. And let me say,
That's where
and I
grace comes in, though.
yes, and let me say, there's a way. That's a hard thing to come to when you are used to having wider capacity. And I see the person in the chat who's talking, so I know that's hard for you, Reverend Jamie, because you are used to having wider capacity. When you hit the wall, that's I mean, it's hard. It's hard for anybody, but particularly when you really, when when you rocking and rolling and you juggling and you like doing tricks and spinning around and stuff, and then the things you were juggling just start to fall around you. And they don't fall like when you juggling them, there's a nice rhythm. When they start falling, it's just chaos.
True.
So that's hard. I love this point that you made, Dr. Turner Wood, about the line between hope and lying. I think the thing about, I think it can be a thin line. I do think that I think hope doesn't pretend. I think we don't say things, we're back to preaching now, right? Um, Sometimes we say we're being hopeful and we're just lying. We do a lot of that at funerals, right? We don't sorrow as those who have no hope. And so what we invite people to do in funerals is sometimes to pretend that they're not sorrowful at all. That's lying. That's that's to me, there are times when the line is thin, and sometimes there are times when the line isn't actually thin, where we won't live with the pain of the moment, the tension of the moment. We won't live with what we don't know. I go back to Paul again. We want to pretend that we can see the way this is going to turn out and it's going to be great, when in fact what we really are, what the best when the best we can offer is committing the situation to God and committing ourselves to the world we want to see. So back to my objection at Tyree Nichols' funeral. I think it's one thing to say this is wrong, and we're not just going to take it for granted. That's one thing. It's another thing to say this is wrong, but everything is going to change. That is probably a lie. That's not committing our way to God and ourselves to God's ways. That's promising something that God didn't promise us, that I don't see God promising.
Right.
Yes, Reverend Anetra, this hurts. And often, it happened in this conversation for me. Often it was in the naming of the hurt that I found my way to the place of hopefulness.
Right.
I didn't start there. And whatever hopeful conclusions I would have come to that didn't honor the depths of the challenge wouldn't have been as comforting as what I actually ended up with. it wouldn't actually have been as hopeful.
That's where you ended. Yeah.
As where I ended.
I, I want to pause for a moment to ask you, as a member of the board of Woman Preach, to talk about why you give to the organization and to invite other people to join you.
Um, I have been around Woman Preach since its inception.
Mm-hmm.
And the hope that I have had from the beginning of our journey in Woman Preach is that we would stamp out bad preaching one person at a time. And I 12 years are we in?
Oh no, we're closer to 14.
I lost the whole 3 years of the pandemic. 14 years in, what I can say is that the fruit of our labor is helping people to come to voice and to proclaim the gospel, to hear God's voice from their own throat, and to do the work part of sermon development and preparation to make room for the magic and the mystery and to get out of the way of it. And I think that is a worthy pursuit. And it's why I give my time to Woman Preach. I've been on the board since there's been a board. It's why I give financially to Woman Preach. It's why I show up. I showed up this evening when I didn't feel well, and Dr. Bridgman didn't feel well either. And because I believe that Woman Preach contributes to the work of the gospel and to a vision of preaching community, prophetic community, to be support to one another. So I invite you. I think in a minute we're going to see.
Tina, you're going to put up.
We're going to see. And Reverend Anetra is. Reverend Anetra is testifying in the chat. Want to be very clear, we don't stamp the preacher. We don't beat up preachers. We offer tools that help them to stamp out the death-dealing theologies often and ideologies. And get out of the way of and not be obstructive to the call. In some ways, in some ways I see what we do is helping people to get in the way to actually being useful and to show up to the preaching as themselves, as ourselves. Because part of the bad theology is this idea that we should disappear. That the gospel is better if you cannot see me while I'm proclaiming it. I just think that's wrong. But anyway, to help people to really come to terms with their own identities and the way that God will use the people we are to proclaim good news.
Tierney or Amy, would you post the giving? I saw somebody put the giving link in the chat again. That would be helpful. I want to end with this, going back to who we call our patron saint, Jarena Lee.
I know people can see the chat, but there's some wonderful testimonies that are going on in the chat from people who've been blessed by Woman Preach. And some of y'all's faves, some of y'all's faves have been blessed by Woman Preach. So I'm sorry. I know we're trying to
No,
raise
no,
money, but that's the reason to give. And that's the reason also, if you haven't been to a woman preach event, it is worth your time. It's worth the investment. And if you feel the nudge of the Spirit saying to you, do this weekend or do the Jarena Lee Preaching Academy, take that risk and come on.
we'll be in Atlanta, March 18, 19. You can find the program registration on the website. And yeah, Jarena Lee applications are open now for the 2024 Academy. You can also find that on the website. I want to thank you for pressing through your not feeling well, for both of us pressing through, because it's
Thank
still.
you for inviting me to be in conversation.
Yeah, I think it was a great conversation. I think you dropped some real pearls of wisdom for folk who are on this journey, sisters, but really all preachers who are on this journey. And if we would learn that, it makes me want to end with what my mother used to say to us: if you can believe it's a bumpy road and not just a bump in the road, you'll quit being surprised when you hit the bump.
Amen. That's right. It is.
Sorry that you're not feeling well. We lasted. We made it almost. Yes.
I got excited and choked up. I got so excited, I got choked up. I wasn't coughing before I got on the call.
I know. I know. Well, thank you all for coming. I think there will be a way to share it with our friends. I think this has been a meaningful conversation. I hope you have too. God bless everyone, and good night.
Good night, everybody. Thank you for having me. Can we go backstage?
I couldn't see how.
Maybe Tierney can put us backstage.
Mommy, are you on another meeting? Are you on a meeting? Can I see?
Yeah. I think everybody's gone.
Hi.
Okay,
Are we, Tierney, are we backstage?
Streaming.
What'd you say?
It says we're still live streaming.
Maybe Tierney can put us backstage. Or we can just hang up and I'll call you.
Okay, leaving the studio.